weeks to impact, 3 weeks to consequence. That's the timeline that the White House has set. As we record on the 8th of July, yesterday, the White House reported that the US will impose a 30% blanket tariff on South African products starting from the 1st of August, 3 weeks from now. On top of this, they announced that an additional 10% tariff will be put on countries that align with BRICS, which, as we know, South Africa is a member of. This would bring the potential tariff burden on South African products to 40%. And all of this comes as the 90-day pause on some of those aggressive tariff imports was set to expire this week. Here to help us make sense of the recent developments is Keeve Hattingh, Executive Director from the Center for Risk Analysis. Chris, I want us to start with the letter President Trump posted on the 7th of July on his social media. In it, the US announced that they will place a 30% tariff on South African products from the 1st of August. In your opinion, does this nullify the benefits that South Africa has been enjoying under AGOA, or can we not make that call yet?
Thanks very much, Anlu. So technically, of course, the current iteration of AGOA is set to expire on the 30th of September. But with that being said, I don't think that South African exporters that have benefited from AGOA should put their stall in AGOA being renewed. And why I say that is not that we want to make assumptions in the field or the work of risk and policy analysis, but we go and look at the language that is used by politicians, by bureaucrats, by policymakers over time. And even before he was re-elected or elected at the end of last year into his second term as US president, President Trump has reiterated his view, his colleagues' view of trade deficits, of what they view as trade imbalances between the US and other countries. So I think it is consistent with their philosophy, as it were, around trade and generally the sort of economic, the current sort of status quo of the global economy and the US's role therein, that they wouldn't favor trade agreements like AGOA because they prefer that the US has more negotiating power and leverage in country-to-country trade agreements. So one-to-one versus these sort of wider block trade agreements. Now, that's not to say that we might not get a new form of AGOA, but I think it's going to be quite radically different. I think for President Trump and his colleagues, such as the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, a few others like Howard Lutnick, they will make the assessment that the US has been taken advantage of in things like AGOA. Maybe those agreements have done some good for those African countries like South Africa that have benefited, but they think it's a new era now for trade agreements, and that's why they prefer this kind of reciprocity. And it's also interesting one could spend hours going through each line in President Trump's letter, of which, of course, he sent to other countries as well. I mean, to traditional strong US allies like South Korea and Japan. They've been hit with a 25% tariff as well. But just on the language, the President Trump mentions that our relationship, so the relationship between South Africa and the US, has been unfortunately far from reciprocal. So really homing in and using this language around reciprocity and fairness time after time after time.
Yeah, I want us to, as you said, look at another line in the letter, and you mentioned negotiation. So in the letter, they also said that, or warned rather, that if South Africa decides to respond with their own tariffs, that those would simply be added on top of the 30%. And then at the same time, something that caught my attention or that stood out is that when a reporter asked Trump whether the August deadline was fixed, Trump said that they're still open to decisions or discussions. But he added, and this is what stood out, others we met with, and we don't think we're going to be able to make a deal, so we just send them a letter. So the question is, do you think the fact that we received this letter, that South Africa is one of the 14 countries who received a letter, is that part of Trump's negotiation tactics? If so, do we have room for negotiation? Is there room for us to interpret the consequences of this tariff the trade the tariff type negotiation style that we're moving into?
No, I think you're on the money. President Trump, arguably everything he has at his disposal, he uses in negotiations, whether it's with other countries, whether it's with people in his own cabinet. The sort of political movement he has built in the Republican Party and the MAGA movement, it's composed of very different groups as well. There's strong fiscal conservatives, there's others who wouldn't be considered sort of quote unquote traditional Republican. So if he can do that domestically, build this broad coalition, and you saw that also in terms of how US citizens voted for him across racial and income groupings and lines. I think it makes sense that he would use things like the possibility of negotiation and the threat of higher tariffs in pursuit of the rejigging the US trade relationship with other countries, but also maybe some other elements of priorities he and his colleagues think are in the US's best interest. So whether it's geostrategically, the importance of a country's ports, whether it's access to critical minerals, whether it's how that country supports the US at the United Nations or not, how that country might be perceived to be closer to US enemies, traditional US enemies or not. Trade and the threat of tariffs, I think, can be used in these wider discussions and negotiations. It's interesting also, again, we're going to focus a lot on the letter. I'm just tying this to another aspect. But President Trump does also repeat quite a bit non-tariff trade barriers and non-tariff barriers. And often those can be very widely interpreted. So arguably, there could be things included in there that they feel, the US administration feels, South Africa needs to address, which aren't traditionally considered in the sort of trade policy trade space, trade deficit space.
Well, it's reassuring to hear that there is perhaps some space still to negotiate and to discuss. One of the few reasons that companies choose to manufacture in South Africa is to benefit under this export-free tariff to the US under AGOA that we mentioned earlier. And as we discussed last week on the channel, with the Mercedes-Benz temporary shutdown, and then the Chinese and Korean automotive markets holding now nearly 50% of the local market, there's, I assume, fewer reasons for global companies to keep producing in South Africa. Does South Africa still have a real competitive advantage that we can actually offer to businesses to stay in South Africa, to keep their manufacturing local and to continue investing in our economy? Is there something that we can offer them competitive advantage on?
If there is, it has been worn away over time. And unfortunately, the South African government has tended to put the blame for that erosion of competitiveness, South Africa's global competitiveness, on global factors. So there's always a crutch or there's always an excuse to blame. So it's the global financial crisis, it's COVID and the lockdowns, it's the burdens imposed by bodies like the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO. The issue really, I think, comes to a head, and this has exposed South Africa at this point in time, from a US point of view and President Trump's focus, where we haven't done the kind of domestic policy reform to make ourselves more competitive and more fit for purpose, to attract investment, to attract capital. In our favor, we have things like a relatively cheaper labor supply. We've got a growing population. We've got well-developed links with the rest of sub-Saharan Africa and the SADC region, of course, the biggest player in which South Africa remains. But that competitiveness in our ports, in our electricity, in our logistics, on a crime point of view, crime and safety, those have all been worn away and made it much more costly for those businesses to operate in South Africa and to then export to a place like the US. So if you are headquartered in Europe or even in Southeast Asia, maybe in China, you ask the question, what are the barriers to investment in South Africa that you need to outlay because the state doesn't take care of it? You need to add more costs to get your business even up to a normal standard, a manufacturing export standard. And then you still have to compete with other companies, maybe locally, that get government subsidies, for example, that get other forms of government support. So I don't want to discount that South Africa could still have some cards to play correctly, but it's just those policy choices have been firmly within its own ambit, and it hasn't made the right kind of policy choices. I think there's been an element of protectionism and sort of trying to look after some key players in local industry that has come to the overall cost, because the focus then hasn't been on the kind of policy reforms that would make South Africa more competitive, given, again, emerging market, growing population, all that kind of thing that really should play in our favor.
Yeah, and especially play in our favor in the longer term. And so the next issue isn't a 3 weeks kind of impact issue, but it certainly has serious implications for the longer term, and we'll need to monitor it. And this is the issue of economists often refer to it as price elasticity of demand, but basically what it means is just how the demand for a product will react to price changes of that product. So if something gets more expensive, how does it react? The demand for it reacts. And it really just, it depends on the nature of the good. So when we consider the ripple effects of these tariffs, it's important for us not to only consider the volume of exports that we have with the US, but also the nature of these exports. So can you maybe walk us through what are we actually exporting to the US, and how can that potentially lead to higher interest rates? Because given how closely our own interest rates are linked to global and specifically US interest rates, this could potentially affect our economy in the long term.
Yeah, so I mean, number one on the exposure side, the two biggest the sectors that are most exposed, agriculture and autos and manufacturing. On the autos side, it is automobiles, but also lots of components of those, where South Africa is an integral part of many of these global supply chains and value chains. On the agricultural side, you've got your things like wine, citrus, all that kind of thing, which does, again, very much expose the Western Cape, especially the Western Cape economy, which has benefited a lot, not only from the exports to the US in and of themselves, but also from the AGOA tariff-free access to US markets. So those two jump to mind. There will be others downstream affected, like construction, maybe some others. One doesn't want to oversell the hit to South African GDP should we lose AGOA access, but you also can't discount what it does from a GDP, pure numbers point of view, but just for South Africa's, the sentiment around South Africa. Should we lose AGOA access? Should we get these 30% tariffs? How do we then pivot those exports elsewhere? You can't do that kind of thing overnight. You can't just retool a factory completely overnight and find a new export market for whatever product you might want you used to send to the US and just automatically find a new market. It can be done, but given again how our government and our bureaucrats tend to take a bit of time with these kinds of things, it does expose those companies quite a lot. If you talk about agriculture, your farmers, your packers, all this sort of factory, industrial activity, all of that, I think, over time is quite heavily impacted. If we also look just South Africa's sort of base manufacturing in terms of things like aluminium, steel, I mean, those industries have also been worn down, their competitiveness, never mind internationally, but domestically. We've seen demand for steel decline quite radically over time. The contribution that South African manufacturing makes to GDP relatively has also declined over time. So all in all, I think quite serious ripple effects throughout the whole economy and to South Africa's reputation as a kind of manufacturing investment, capital friendly hub, which has declined. But if this sort of thing happens, it takes a further hit. And then just on maybe the second aspect of what you touched on interest rates. So there are various factors that will go into this. The South African Reserve Bank is, in its current iteration, is famously hawkish. And what I mean by that is, maybe I should rather say skittish. So they're very sensitive to global factors. When there's the possibility of declining global growth, when there's the possibility that developed economies like the US's, like the Federal Reserve, will keep interest rates higher for longer, the Reserve Bank then adopts a much more cautious stance and might keep interest rates higher for longer. They'll also need to see if let's see, if oil prices increase, if global prices in things like manufacturing broadly increase. South Africa is very exposed to imported inflation, again, because our domestic manufacturing capacity has declined. We import more manufactured goods. Now, if the prices of those, of course, increase over time, then you import that inflation. And the Reserve Bank, it's not going to want to be caught on the back foot in terms of trying to, when it should have preempted keeping rates higher and then having to do it after the fact, because, of course, then again, you just erode economic activity all the faster, and possibly it's that tipping point into a recession where the South African economy probably won't take much to be tipped into recession, given that we consistently operate below 1% growth. So given that we're quite an open economy, we are especially exposed to how things go in places like Japan, South Korea, Germany, the US, with their respective central banks and what they do with their interest rates.
You mentioned pivoting some of our exports. We saw in response to the tariffs that the presidency urged South African businesses and trade negotiation teams to accelerate their diversification. What can South African businesses do to proactively or take proactive steps to prepare themselves for the potential economic implications of something like a 40% tariff?
Yeah, again, the question is things like reshoring and friendshoring. These concepts have been gaining more traction in the last year or two. What I mean by that is not necessarily having to rejig one's whole export strategy overnight, but looking at where can aspects of that be moved elsewhere. Where can you link up then with countries either still in North America in some aspects, with certain states, maybe with countries like Canada and Mexico, Latin America, where you might have then less travel time in terms of your goods on ships and that kind of thing. So you might then benefit from lower costs in that regard. Of course, you don't have the big consumer market that you have in the US, but there's a question. I think the opportunity into the rest of Africa, into growing economies like Rwanda, Kenya, Ghana. If we look at the East Coast, there are elements of more industrial activity ramping up now than had been the case before. The US itself is very aggressive on the Lobito corridor with countries like Angola. There could be an opportunity there to still pursue mutually beneficial trade with the US via those kinds of agreements. And then if we look at places like Southeast Asia, possibly Europe as well, I think South African exporters, assuming they can count on things like the ports and other basic government infrastructure functioning as they should, which, one should never assume that kind of thing in the South African case. You need to plan for it and mitigate it where you can. Then South Africa and South African exporters, I think, can still do all right. But given just how important the US is as a consumer market, it is vital that South Africa retains some kind of lower tariff access in that regard. I don't think it's ever going to be tariff-free access. I think the new normal is at least a 10% universal baseline tariff. It now depends on what is added on top of that. So maybe there's something for South Africa to look into as well. And just on the sort of foreign relations, foreign policy point of view, the BRICS question, South Africa's overtures towards a country like Iran, just to look at where South Africa can seize the moment to not add yet more tariffs onto the reciprocal tariff point. So it's also it's unfortunately the brute reality of the geopolitics at the moment. South Africa is in a much weaker trading position than the US, and it needs to deal with that accordingly and what that implies for the rest of its priorities if the government wants to pursue things like growth and investment.
You touched on BRICS, and as we close, maybe I can just ask this hanging question. What do you think is the likelihood of South Africa having to face this extra 10% tariff? Could perhaps some BRIC members get a different treatment? We've shown on more than one occasion that we're not necessarily the most American-loving BRICS country. So should we prepare for that extra 10%?
So I think quite a lot will depend on what President Trump and his colleagues consider BRICS policies. So the first thing that comes to mind is the possibility of a BRICS currency and how that would challenge the dollar, for example. We'll need to see how the BRICS grouping, which it's not a formalized alliance. It doesn't have a secretariat. It doesn't have that kind of cohesion that the G7, even the G20 in some ways has. There's strong disagreements between countries like India and China, and of course between countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran. They're all part of BRICS, but they've got their own respective, more important trading partners elsewhere. So let's see exactly what these BRICS policies are that President Trump is more concerned about, and then how he uses that particular approach in this negotiation. But South Africa, if we still think 7 months into the second Trump administration, President Trump isn't going to pursue some of these things, perhaps in a roundabout way or a different way than people think they can predict. He campaigned on rejigging trade. He campaigned on trying to lower the trade deficit. One can criticize it from an macroeconomics point of view, all that kind of thing. I take all that on board. But he is pursuing in different avenues what he envisions. And South Africa consistently is caught on the back foot. I think the White House visit by President Ramaphosa, in some quarters, it is perceived that it went as well as it could have gone. And we've sort of sat back and thought, okay, we will just now allow more access to South Africa for US pork exports, or we're going to buy US gas. that doesn't take into consideration some of the other issues that the Trump administration has raised in the relationship with South Africa, and that is forming part of this whole thing. And that could then also be linked to things like the BRICS alliance as well. So, yeah, if one thought that President Trump and his colleagues were going to run out of steam and stop trying to move things along in the trade space, and others, I think one would have been sorely disappointed in that regard. But it does open up, I think, quite an opportunity for South Africa, again, if it uses it correctly.
Well, that wraps up today's tariff discussion. In summary, 30% on goods, 10% on alignment, and 40% on principle. Thank you, Chris, for your analysis. To our viewers, stay tuned for more expert takes on the risks shaping our world. That's from us, the CRA. Until next time.